The moving truck pulled away, leaving Amy standing alone in front of her new house. She let out a long breath and smiled. The house wasn't much to look at, just a simple ranch-style home with beige siding and a small front porch. But after the year she'd had, it felt like a sanctuary. Pinewood Estates was exactly the kind of neighborhood she'd been searching for. Quiet streets, well-kept homes, and mature oak trees lining both sides of the road. She could already picture herself sitting on that porch in the evenings with a cup of tea, finally having some peace. At 45 years old and freshly divorced, peace was all she wanted. The first few days were busy with unpacking and setting up her new life. Amy had taken a job teaching at the community college about 20 minutes away. Nothing glamorous, but it paid the bills and gave her a reason to start fresh in a new town. Her old life felt like it belonged to someone else now. This was her chance to just be herself, away from all the drama and noise. Her neighbors seemed nice enough. The elderly couple next door waved every morning. A young mom from down the street stopped by with a plate of brownies and a friendly smile. Everyone was polite and welcoming, though Amy noticed they all said something similar when they found out she was new. "Make sure you stay on top of the HOA stuff," the young mom said, her smile faltering just a bit. "Richard can be, well, he's very thorough about the rules." Amy nodded and made a mental note. She'd gotten a whole binder of HOA rules when she closed on the house. It had seemed like a lot, but she figured most of it was common sense stuff. Don't park on the lawn, keep your trash cans hidden, no bright pink houses. Standard neighborhood stuff. She had no idea what she was actually in for. It happened on a Saturday morning. Amy was outside in yoga pants and an old college sweatshirt, kneeling in her flower bed trying to pull out some stubborn weeds. She was lost in thought, planning what flowers she might plant when she heard the quiet hum of an electric motor. A white golf cart rolled to a stop at the end of her driveway. A man climbed out and everything about him screamed, "I take myself very seriously." He wore pressed khaki shorts, a navy blue polo shirt with an embroidered logo she couldn't quite make out, and spotless white sneakers. He carried a clipboard like it was a badge of honor. "Good morning," he called out, though his voice carried no warmth. "Richard Pemberton. HOA president, you're the new owner here." It wasn't really a question. Amy stood up and brushed the dirt off her hands. "Hi, yes. I'm Amy. Nice to meet you." Richard didn't offer his hand. His eyes were already scanning her property, moving from the mailbox to the windows to the small garden area where she'd been working. He frowned slightly and jotted something on his clipboard. "I wanted to personally welcome you to Pinewood Estates and remind you that we have very specific community standards here," he said. "These standards are what keep our property values high and our neighborhood desirable." "Of course," Amy said, trying to be friendly. "I got all the rules when I bought the place." "Good. Then you're aware that all exterior paint must be maintained." He pointed at her mailbox with his pen. "That mailbox is fading. According to our guidelines, all mailboxes must be painted in approved colors and kept in good condition. I'll expect that to be addressed within 2 weeks." Amy looked at her mailbox. It was black. It looked completely normal to her. Maybe a tiny bit dusty, but nothing that looked bad. "Oh, okay. I didn't notice anything wrong with it, but I can repaint it," she said. "See that you do." Richard made another note. "We've worked hard to maintain standards here. When one property starts to slip, it affects everyone's home values. I'm sure you understand." Before she could respond, he was back in his golf cart driving slowly down the street like a security guard on patrol. Amy stood there feeling confused and slightly annoyed. Her mailbox looked fine, but she didn't want to start off on the wrong foot in her new neighborhood, so the next day she bought paint and carefully redid the entire thing. It looked exactly the same as before, just shinier. She thought that would be the end of it. 4 days later, she found an official letter in that freshly painted mailbox. It was on HOA letterhead with her address typed at the top. The letter informed her that her lawn had exceeded the maximum permitted grass height of 2.5 inches. She had 72 hours to correct the violation or face a $50 fine. Amy walked around her yard, genuinely confused. Her grass looked like everyone else's grass. She'd mowed it less than a week ago. She got down on her knees with a ruler and measured. In one shady spot near the side of the house, the grass was maybe 3 inches tall. Maybe. She mowed it again that evening, even though it barely needed it. The next week brought another letter. Her trash can had been visible from the street for more than 12 hours after pickup. $50 fine if it happened again. Then came the letter about her car. She'd parked in her own driveway like normal people do, but apparently the front bumper extended slightly past the edge of her driveway. This was a violation of Section 18, Paragraph 3. Amy sat on her porch reading that one twice. She'd parked in her own driveway, on her own property, and somehow that was wrong. She moved her car back 6 inches and sat there for a long moment staring at nothing. This wasn't normal. This wasn't what HOAs were supposed to be like. This felt personal, like someone was watching her house specifically looking for things to complain about. The worst part was, she couldn't even really argue with it. Technically, each letter referenced an actual rule. The rules were ridiculous, but they existed in that thick binder she'd signed off on. Amy went inside and pulled out the HOA rules. She started reading them more carefully this time. There were rules about everything. Paint colors, fence heights, garden decorations where you could park, what time you could water your lawn, how many pets you could have, what kind of mailbox flags were allowed. It was like someone had sat down and tried to think of every possible thing a person might do with their own home, and then made a rule against it. She closed the binder and rubbed her temples. This was supposed to be her fresh start, her peaceful new beginning. From 3 houses down, Richard sat at his dining room table with his binoculars, making notes in his personal log. The new resident seemed compliant so far, quiet, respectful, following the rules after appropriate reminders. He smiled to himself. He had no idea that the quiet woman he'd been targeting wasn't what she seemed. He had no idea what was coming. 3 weeks into living at Pinewood Estates, Amy had received 7 violation letters. 7. She kept them in a folder on her kitchen counter, reading through them sometimes just to make sure she wasn't going crazy. A lawn gnome she'd put by her flowers, gone. Apparently it violated the decorative items clause. The small bird feeder she'd hung from her porch, taken down. It wasn't on the approved list. Even the welcome mat with sunflowers on it had to be replaced because it was yellow, and doormats could only be brown, black, or gray. Amy had always considered herself an easygoing person. She didn't like conflict. She preferred to just go along and keep the peace. But this was getting ridiculous. The worst part wasn't even the letters anymore. It was Richard himself. He'd started showing up at her house, not just driving by in his golf cart, but actually coming to her door. The first time it was 7:30 on a Saturday morning. Amy had just gotten out of bed, her hair was a mess, and she was still in her pajamas when the doorbell rang. Richard stood on her porch with his clipboard, looking like he'd been awake for hours. "Good morning, Amy. I wanted to discuss your landscaping plans with you." She blinked at him, still half asleep. "My landscaping plans?" "Yes, I noticed you've been working in the front flower bed. Any significant changes to landscaping require approval from the architectural committee. That's on page 47 of your guidelines." Amy felt her jaw tighten. "I'm just pulling weeds and planning to plant some flowers. Nothing major. All the same, I'll need you to submit a written proposal with the specific plants you intend to use. We need to ensure they're appropriate for the neighborhood aesthetic." He handed her a form. "Please have this completed and submitted within 5 business days." He walked away before she could respond. Amy stood there holding the form, feeling her blood pressure rising. She needed permission to plant flowers, in her own yard, that she owned, but Richard wasn't done. He started coming by at least twice a week, always finding something new to point out. Her newspaper had been sitting on the driveway for more than 2 hours one morning, when he knocked on her door to remind her that newspapers must be retrieved promptly. Her garage door had been left open while she ran inside to grab her phone. He was there within minutes, to inform her that open garage doors were a security concern and violated community standards. The man seemed to watch her house constantly. Other neighbors started giving her sympathetic looks. One morning, the elderly man next door caught her checking her mailbox and walked over. "Don't let him get to you," he said quietly. "Richard does this to someone new every few months. He picks a target and just won't let up." "Why doesn't anyone stop him?" Amy asked. The old man shrugged sadly. "He's been HOA president for 12 years. Most people are just glad it's not them." "I'm sorry you're dealing with this." That conversation should have made Amy feel better, but it didn't. It made her feel worse. This was intentional. Richard was deliberately harassing her, and everyone knew it. but nobody wanted to get involved. Things came to a head at the monthly HOA meeting. Amy had never planned to attend these meetings. She wasn't much of a joiner, and sitting around talking about neighborhood business sounded boring. But she'd received a letter stating that residents with 3 or more violations were strongly encouraged to attend to discuss their compliance issues. She didn't want to go. But she also didn't want Richard showing up at her house anymore, so she went. The meeting was held at the community center, a small building near the neighborhood entrance. About 30 people were there, sitting in folding chairs arranged in rows. Richard stood at the front with a microphone, even though the room was small enough that he didn't need one. Amy sat in the back, hoping to be invisible. She wasn't. After some boring discussions about repainting the pool area and updating the playground equipment, Richard pulled out his notes. "Now I'd like to address a concerning trend we've been seeing with some of our newer residents," he said, his voice booming through the microphone. "We have standards in this community, standards that were established to protect everyone's investment and maintain our property values." He looked directly at Amy. "Some residents seem to think these rules don't apply to them, that they can just move in and do whatever they want without regard for the rest of us." He flipped through his notes. Multiple violations, failure to properly maintain property, resistance to basic compliance requests. Amy felt her face get hot. People were turning around to look at her. She wanted to sink through the floor. "I've personally spent considerable time trying to help this resident understand our community expectations," Richard continued. "But there seems to be an attitude problem, a belief that individual preferences matter more than community standards." An older woman in the front row nodded along. A few other people whispered to each other. Amy's hands were shaking. She wasn't someone who spoke up in groups. She hated being the center of attention. But something snapped inside her. She stood up. "I've repainted my mailbox. I've mowed my lawn twice a week. I've taken down decorations. I've moved my car. I've followed every single rule." Her voice was quiet but steady. "I'm not trying to cause problems. I just want to live in my house in peace." Richard's smile was thin and cold. "If you'd wanted to live without rules, you shouldn't have bought in an HOA community. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable elsewhere." The dismissal in his voice was clear. A few people actually chuckled. Amy sat back down, her heart pounding. She felt humiliated and angry and helpless all at once. She stayed for the rest of the meeting because leaving felt like admitting defeat. But she didn't hear a single word that was said. When it was over, she walked to her car alone. Most people avoided eye contact with her. As she drove home, Amy gripped the steering wheel tightly. Richard had just publicly humiliated her in front of her neighbors. He'd painted her as some kind of problem resident when all she'd done was try to live quietly in her own house. She pulled into her driveway and sat there for a long moment. Through her rearview mirror, she could see Richard's golf cart slowly driving past, the man himself looking at her house as he went by. Amy took a deep breath. She'd spent her whole life avoiding conflict, staying quiet, not making waves. And where had that gotten her? A failed marriage. A life she'd had to leave behind. And now a bully who thought he could push her around forever. She didn't know it yet, but something had shifted. The quiet compliance that Richard had counted on was starting to crack, and when it finally broke, he was going to be very, very surprised. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, and this one was different. Amy opened it while drinking her coffee, expecting another complaint about her mailbox or grass or something equally absurd. But when she read it, her hands started shaking. A $500 fine for unauthorized landscaping modifications. She read it 3 times to make sure she understood. The small flower bed she'd planted, the one she'd actually submitted a form for, like Richard had demanded. Apparently, her form had been denied due to incomplete information, but she'd never received any notification about that. And now, because she'd planted flowers without approval, she owed $500. Amy grabbed her phone and called the HOA office number listed on the letter. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. She left a message trying to keep her voice calm, asking for clarification. Nobody called back. She tried again the next day. And the day after that. On Friday, she finally got through to someone. A bored-sounding woman told her that all fines were final, and she needed to speak to Richard directly if she had concerns. When Amy asked for his phone number, the woman said she couldn't give out personal information and hung up. That weekend, Amy did something she'd been avoiding. She started looking up information about HOAs online. What she found made her stomach sink. Stories of people being harassed, fined into bankruptcy, even losing their homes over HOA disputes. Forums full of people sharing their nightmares with power-hungry board members. She also found information about how to fight back, how to request mediation, how to challenge fines, how to document harassment. Monday morning, Amy wrote a formal letter disputing the fine. She included copies of the form she'd submitted, photos of her flower bed, and a timeline of events. She sent it certified mail so she'd have proof Richard received it. Tuesday evening, he showed up at her door. This time, he wasn't alone. 2 other men stood behind him, both wearing polo shirts with the HOA logo. Amy recognized one of them from the meeting where she'd been humiliated. The other was younger, maybe in his 30s, and looked uncomfortable. "Amy, we need to discuss your continued non-compliance," Richard said. His voice was harder than usual, colder. "I sent you a letter disputing that fine," Amy said. "I submitted the proper paperwork. I have copies. Your paperwork was incomplete. You were informed of this. I was never informed. I never got any response at all." Richard sighed like he was dealing with a difficult child. "That's not my problem. The fine stands, and frankly, your attitude is becoming a real issue for this community." "My attitude?" Amy felt her voice rising. "I've done everything you've asked. I've followed every rule, no matter how ridiculous. And you keep finding new things to complain about. Maybe you should consider whether this neighborhood is the right fit for you," Richard said. He stepped closer to her door. "Some people just aren't cut out for community living. Maybe you'd be happier somewhere else. Somewhere without standards." The way he said it, the smugness in his voice, something inside Amy snapped. "I'm not going anywhere," she said firmly. "This is my home. I bought it, I own it. And you need to stop harassing me." Richard's face darkened. He took another step forward, now standing right at her threshold. The 2 men behind him shifted uncomfortably. "Harassing you? I'm enforcing the rules that you agreed to when you bought here. Rules that everyone else manages to follow without throwing tantrums." His voice was getting louder. "You think you're special? You think the rules don't apply to you? Richard, maybe we should—" the younger man started to say. "Quiet," Richard snapped at him without turning around. He stepped even closer to Amy, his chest puffed out, his finger pointing near her face. "You're going to pay that fine. And if you keep causing problems, there are provisions in our bylaws for forcing non-compliant residents to sell. Don't think I won't use them?" Amy's heart was pounding. Richard was now standing partially in her doorway, invading her space, his voice threatening. The other 2 men looked alarmed but said nothing. "You need to leave my property," Amy said quietly. "Right now," Richard laughed. It was a cruel sound. "Or what? What are you going to do about it, lady? Call the police and complain that the HOA president is doing his job? That'll go over real well." He leaned in even closer, and Amy could smell his cologne mixed with coffee breath. "Here's how this is going to work. You're going to pay that fine. You're going to stop questioning every little thing I tell you, and you're going to accept that in this neighborhood, I make the rules. Got it?" The younger man pulled out his phone. Amy saw him angle it slightly like he was recording, but Richard was too focused on intimidating her to notice. "Last chance," Amy said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Step back and leave my property." "Make me," Richard said with a sneer. He actually made a motion like he was going to push past her into her house. That was his mistake. What Richard didn't know, what nobody in Pinewood Estates knew, was that Amy wasn't just a community college teacher. For the past 25 years, she'd been training in martial arts. She held a 3rd-degree black belt in Shotokan karate. She'd competed in national tournaments. She taught self-defense classes. She'd kept it quiet because that's who she was. Humble, private, unassuming. Martial arts had taught her discipline, control, and that real strength didn't need to be advertised. It was something she did for herself, not for show. But she also knew exactly what to do when someone became physically threatening. In one fluid, practiced motion, Amy sidestepped Richard's advance. Her hand caught his wrist, redirecting his momentum. She applied a basic wrist lock, the kind she taught to beginners. Richard's knees hit her porch with a thud. The whole thing took maybe 2 seconds, he gasped, his eyes wide with shock and pain. Not real pain, just the surprise of suddenly being in a position he didn't understand and couldn't get out of. "I asked you nicely," Amy said calmly. She released his wrist and stepped back. Don't ever come to my property uninvited again. Don't threaten me. And definitely don't try to force your way into my home. Richard scrambled to his feet, his face bright red. He looked like he couldn't decide if he was more shocked, angry, or embarrassed. You assaulted me, he sputtered. I'll have you arrested. I'll sue you. I got the whole thing on video, the younger man said quietly, holding up his phone. You were on her property. She asked you to leave multiple times. You refused and attempted to enter her home. She defended herself. It's all right here. Richard spun around, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. The three men left without another word. Richard practically ran to his golf cart. Amy closed her door and leaned against it, her hands finally shaking now that the adrenaline was wearing off. She'd just put the neighborhood bully on his knees on her front porch, and something told her this was only the beginning. Amy didn't sleep well that night. She kept replaying the incident in her mind, wondering if she'd overreacted. But every time she thought about Richard trying to push his way into her home, she knew she'd done the right thing. Still, she had no idea what would happen next. She found out the next morning. Her doorbell rang at 8 a.m. This time it was the elderly man from next door, the one who'd warned her about Richard weeks ago. His name was Tom, and he was smiling. I don't know if you've seen it yet, he said, but there's a video going around. Everyone in the neighborhood has seen it by now. Amy's stomach dropped. A video? That young guy who was with Richard, he sent it to a few people. And well, you know how these things go. It's everywhere now. Tom's smile widened. Best thing I've seen in years. That man has had it coming for a long time. Within an hour, Amy's phone started buzzing. Texts from neighbors she'd barely spoken to. Friend requests on social media from people in the community. Everyone wanted to talk about what happened. The video was clear. You could hear everything. Richard threatening her. Amy asking him to leave multiple times. Richard refusing and trying to push into her home. And then the quick, controlled movement that put him on his knees. It was obvious to anyone watching that Amy had defended herself, and that she knew exactly what she was doing. But something else happened that Amy didn't expect. People started talking about their own experiences with Richard. The young mom who'd brought her brownies sent a long text. Richard had fined her $300 for having a playset that was 6 inches too tall. When she'd tried to contest it, he'd shown up at her house and screamed at her until she cried. The elderly couple next door had been fined for having the wrong type of flowers in their garden. They'd lived there for 30 years and planted the same flowers every spring. But Richard had decided they weren't neighborhood appropriate anymore. A man 3 streets over had been forced to repaint his entire house because Richard claimed the color had faded too much. The paint was only 3 years old, story after story, dozens of them. People who'd been too scared or too tired to fight back. People who'd just paid the fines and followed the rules because it was easier than dealing with Richard's wrath. By afternoon, Amy's doorbell rang again. This time it was a woman named Helen, probably in her 60s, wearing a business suit. I'm on the HOA board, Helen said. Not the president, obviously, but I've been a board member for 5 years. Can I come in? Amy invited her inside, offering coffee. They sat at the kitchen table. I need to apologize, Helen said. We've all known Richard was out of control. But he's been president for so long, and honestly, most of us were just glad he wasn't targeting us. That's a terrible excuse, I know. Why didn't anyone stop him? Amy asked. Helen sighed. Fear mostly. Richard knows all the rules inside and out. He's threatened board members with lawsuits. He's convinced half the neighborhood that he's the only thing standing between us and chaos. And the people who might have challenged him just moved away rather than deal with him. So what happens now? Now? Helen looked determined. Now we do what we should have done years ago. I've been making calls all morning. We're holding an emergency board meeting tomorrow night. Several people have already filed formal complaints, and with that video as evidence of harassment and intimidation, we finally have what we need to remove him. Amy felt a weight lift off her shoulders. Really? Really. But I need to ask you something. Helen leaned forward. Will you come to the meeting? Will you tell your story? I know it's a lot to ask, especially after what you've been through. But if we're going to do this right, we need everyone to see what's been happening. Amy thought about it. The old her would have said no. Would have just wanted to hide and hope the problem went away. But she wasn't that person anymore. Not after everything. I'll be there, she said. The next evening, the community center was packed. Amy had never seen so many people at an HOA meeting. Every seat was taken and people lined the walls. Richard sat in the front row, his arms crossed, looking furious. Helen called the meeting to order. Her voice was steady and professional. We're here tonight to address serious concerns about HOA management and resident treatment. Over the past 24 hours, we've received 17 formal complaints documenting a pattern of harassment, intimidation, and abuse of power. Richard started to stand up, but another board member, a tall man named George, spoke up. You'll have a chance to respond, Richard. Sit down. For the next hour, people told their stories. Some cried, some were angry. All of them had been hurt by Richard's behavior. Amy spoke too, calmly explaining the months of harassment, the unreasonable fines, and finally, the threatening confrontation at her door. When the video was played on the projector screen, the room went silent. You could hear everything. Richard's threats, his attempt to enter Amy's home, the way she'd defended herself with minimal force. That's taken out of context. Richard shouted, "She attacked me! I was just doing my job." Your job is not to threaten residents or try to enter their homes uninvited, Helen said coldly. We have dozens of documented cases of you abusing your authority. It ends tonight. The vote was unanimous. Richard was removed as HOA president, effective immediately. The board also voted to void every fine he'd issued in the past 2 years pending individual review. They were changing the bylaws to prevent any one person from having unchecked power again. Richard stood up, his face purple with rage. You'll regret this. All of you. This neighborhood will fall apart without me. You need me. Nobody responded. People just watched him storm out, slamming the door behind him. After the meeting, dozens of people came up to Amy. They thanked her. They apologized for not helping sooner. They welcomed her to the neighborhood properly, the way she should have been welcomed from the start. Tom, the elderly neighbor, shook her hand. You did what the rest of us were too scared to do. Thank you. Amy drove home that night feeling something she hadn't felt in months. Relief. And something else too. Pride. Not the arrogant kind, but the quiet kind that comes from standing up for yourself when it matters. She'd come to Pinewood Estates looking for peace. Instead, she'd found a fight. But in fighting back, she'd found something more important. She'd found her voice. The weeks after the meeting were strange. Amy kept expecting Richard to show up at her door again, to find another violation letter in her mailbox, to see that white golf cart cruising past her house. But none of that happened. Richard's house, 3 doors down, sat quiet for about a week. Then a for sale sign appeared in the yard. Amy was weeding her garden when Tom came over with the news. He's moving, Tom said, shaking his head. Can't say I'm sorry to see him go. Word is his wife finally had enough. Apparently, she didn't know half of what he was doing. When she saw that video and heard all the stories, she made him put the house up. Where's he going? Amy asked. Some condo across town, I heard. Far away from here, that's all that matters. Tom smiled. Helen's doing a great job as the new president, by the way. Actual reasonable rules. Imagine that. Amy had noticed the changes. Helen had sent out a newsletter explaining the new approach. The bylaws were being completely rewritten. Fines would be reserved for actual problems, not petty nonsense. Board meetings would be open and transparent. No more one person making all the decisions. But something else was happening too. Something Amy hadn't expected. People kept asking her about martial arts. It started with the young mom from down the street. She knocked on Amy's door one Saturday morning, her daughter holding her hand. I hope this isn't weird, she said, but I saw what you did, how you handled Richard. I've always been scared of confrontation, and I just thought maybe you could teach me, not to fight, but just to feel less afraid, you know? Then came Helen, asking if Amy might consider teaching a class at the community center. Then Tom's wife. Then a teenager from across the street whose parents thought it would be good for her confidence. Amy had never really advertised her martial arts background. She'd taught small classes at gyms before, mostly self-defense workshops for women, but she'd never expected to do it here in her new neighborhood. But the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. These people didn't just want to learn how to defend themselves physically. They wanted to learn what Amy had learned over 25 years of training. How to stand your ground, how to stay calm under pressure, how to be strong without being aggressive. She said yes. The first class met on a Saturday morning at the community center. and Amy had expected maybe 5 or 6 people. 23 showed up. Women, men, teenagers, even a couple of seniors who said they just wanted to feel more confident. Amy stood in front of them, feeling nervous for the first time in a while. "I'm not here to turn you into fighters," she said. "I'm here to teach you that you're stronger than you think, that you can stand up for yourself without fear, that being calm and controlled is more powerful than being loud and aggressive." She taught them basic stances, how to stand with balance and confidence, simple techniques for getting out of grabs. But more than that, she talked about mindset, about boundaries, about the difference between avoiding conflict and allowing yourself to be walked over. After that first class, people stayed to talk. They shared their own stories, not just about Richard, but about other times they'd felt powerless. Bosses who'd taken advantage of them, family members who'd pushed them around, situations where they'd wished they'd had the courage to speak up. "You made it look easy," one woman said, "standing up to him like that." Amy shook her head. "It wasn't easy. I was terrified. But I'd spent years training myself to act despite fear. That's what martial arts really teaches you. Not how to fight, but how to be brave when everything in you wants to run." The classes became a regular thing, every Saturday morning and sometimes Wednesday evenings too. Amy kept them free, refusing payment. This wasn't about making money. It was about giving back to a community that had finally welcomed her. Richard's house sold within a month. A young couple with a baby moved in, and they were nothing like him. Friendly, relaxed, normal people who just wanted to be good neighbors. 6 months after the incident on her porch, Amy sat in her backyard in the evening sun. She'd finally gotten approval for that small fence she'd wanted, and several neighbors had helped her install it. Her garden was full of flowers now, including a few that probably weren't technically on the approved list. But nobody cared anymore. Helen stopped by with lemonade and sat down next to her. "You know, when you moved here, I thought you were just going to be another one of Richard's victims," Helen said. "Someone who'd either leave or learn to keep their head down. I'm glad I was wrong. I almost was that person," Amy admitted. "For a long time, I was that person. In my marriage, at my old job, everywhere. I just went along with whatever other people wanted because I didn't want conflict." "What changed?" Amy thought about it. "I think I just got tired. Tired of making myself smaller so other people could feel bigger. Tired of being pushed around. And I realized I had the tools to stand up for myself. I'd just been too scared to use them." "Well, you inspired a lot of people. This neighborhood is different now, better." Amy smiled. She looked around at her little yard, her house, her peaceful street. This was supposed to be her quiet refuge where she could hide from the world. Instead, it had become the place where she'd finally stopped hiding. Her phone buzzed. A text from one of her students asking if they were still having class tomorrow. She replied yes, then added a reminder to bring water bottles because it was supposed to be hot. 25 years ago, when Amy first walked into a martial arts school, she'd been a scared teenager who just wanted to feel less vulnerable. Her instructor had told her something that day that she'd never forgotten. "Martial arts won't make you fearless," he'd said. "It'll teach you to act despite fear. And that's so much better." Sitting in her backyard in Pinewood Estates watching the sun set over her neighborhood, Amy finally understood what he'd meant. She'd been afraid of Richard. She'd been afraid of conflict, of standing out, of making waves. But she'd acted anyway. And in doing so, she hadn't just changed her own life. She'd changed an entire community. The quiet woman who'd moved in looking for peace had found something better. She'd found her strength. And she'd helped others find theirs too.